ما مواجهیم با نقض آتش بس در زمانی که در دوره‌ای که قرار بوده این وقفه صورت بگیره. هم در لبنان شاهد هستیم نقض آتش بس، هم زعم خودشون محاصره دریایی ایران و هم تعرض به یک کشتی تجاری که همه اینها هم نقض فاحش حقوق بین الملل و منشور سازمان ملل متحد هست و هم نقض صریح آتش بس. در چنین مواردی، در چنین وضعیتی واقعا نمونه می شود که ادعای آمریکا برای مصالحه و دیپلماسی ما کماکان در وضعیت جنگی هستیم. درسته که ظاهراً آتش بسی اعلام شده، آتش بسی که متاسفانه از همون ابتدا با نقض‌های مکرر از سوی آمریکا باش مواجه بودیم و بعد اعلام این که بنادر و کشتی‌های ایران مورد هدف آمریکا قرار خواهند گرفت، خب قضیه رو پیچیده‌تر کرد. مادامی که این وضعیت وجود داشته باشه، خب ما نمیتونیم به صورت یکسویه در مورد عادی شدن تردد در تنگه هرمز صحبت بکنیم.
What is happening right now between Washington and Tehran is not a diplomatic impasse in the ordinary sense of that phrase. It is not a negotiation that has stalled, not a communication that has broken down, not a misunderstanding that patient diplomacy might eventually resolve what we are witnessing in real time across the corridors of power from the Persian Gulf to the streets of Islamabad is the final architecture of a pressure campaign so mathematically precise, so strategically overwhelming that the nation it targets has been left with no vocabulary adequate to describe its own situation. Iran is not negotiating from weakness. Iran has passed the threshold of weakness and entered a territory that has no comfortable name in the conventional literature of geopolitics when a nation cannot send its negotiators to a table, not because it lacks the will, but because sending them would constitute an admission it cannot survive. Making that nation is not engaged in a diplomatic process. It is engaged in a performance of resistance conducted for a domestic audience, while the foundations beneath it continue irreversibly to crack. Let us establish with complete precision what has just occurred, and why every person watching this broadcast needs to understand not just the surface events, but the structural machinery operating beneath them. The United States has seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. That sentence, delivered in isolation, sounds like a routine incident in an ongoing pattern of confrontation. It is not routine, it is not incidental. It is a message delivered with the full weight of American naval power through the single geographic feature around which Iran has constructed its entire deterrence doctrine for 4.5 decades. The Strait of Hormuz, 17 miles wide at its narrowest point, has been Iran's ultimate card, its irreplaceable leverage, the geographic reality that allowed a sanctioned and isolated nation to maintain relevance in global strategic calculations. For 40 years, Iranian leaders threatened to close this waterway whenever external pressure exceeded comfortable levels. For 40 years, global oil markets flinched. For 40 years, Washington moderated its approach because the economic consequences of a closed Hormuz were simply too catastrophic to absorb. That era is over. When the United States seizes an Iranian-flagged vessel, not outside the strait, not in distant international waters, but inside the Strait of Hormuz itself, it is not conducting a maritime enforcement operation. It is conducting a demonstration. It is communicating in language that requires no translation and admits no ambiguity. That the geography Iran believed was its protection is now operating under American terms. The response from Tehran was immediate, and it was, in its own way, more revealing than any official statement could have been. Iran has announced it will not send negotiators to Pakistan for the next round of nuclear talks. This decision, covered by Al Jazeera, deserves to be examined not as a diplomatic move but as a diagnostic of Iran's internal condition, because the decision to skip these talks is not a unified strategic choice made by a government in full command of its own foreign policy. It is the visible symptom of a government that has lost the ability to speak with one voice on the question that determines whether it survives. President Masoud Pezeshkian's administration has been signaling through carefully calibrated back channels, through the quiet diplomatic architecture that foreign ministers build when they understand the mathematics of their own situation, that Iran was prepared to engage, that Iran understood the cost of perpetual confrontation, that some form of accommodation with external powers had become not a betrayal of revolutionary principles, but a requirement for the continuation of anything worth calling a state. Those signals reached Washington. Washington acted on them. A second round of talks was being arranged. Pakistan tightened security across Islamabad. 20,000 security personnel were deployed. Parts of the capital were locked down. The infrastructure of diplomacy was assembled visibly in preparation for a conversation that both sides at some level needed to happen. And then the United States seized an Iranian ship in the Strait of Hormuz, and Tehran announced it would not be coming. The sequence matters, the timing matters, because what happened between those two events, between the preparation for talks and the refusal to attend them, was not a change in Iranian foreign policy. It was a demonstration of who inside Iran actually makes Iranian foreign policy. It was not the foreign minister. It was not the president. It was not the elected government that Pezeshkian leads and that carries whatever democratic legitimacy the Islamic Republic permits to exist. Vice President JD Vance will land in Islamabad on Tuesday. That confirmation came directly from the White House. He travels not alone, but with Steve Witkoff, the United States Special Envoy, and Jared Kushner, the President's son-in-law and one of the architects of the regional diplomatic framework that has reshaped the Middle East's power geometry over the past several years. This is not a delegation assembled for a courtesy visit. This is the full weight of American executive power deployed to a city that was preparing to host negotiations that will now occur on one side of the table with empty chairs on the other. President Donald Trump has been explicit. He has posted on social media speaking directly about Iran standing at, in his framing, the cusp of an opportunity. He has argued publicly that he has been successful in achieving regime change. That phrase, regime change, deployed by an American president in the context of ongoing nuclear negotiations in the same week that the United States seizes an Iranian vessel in Iranian territorial waters, is not rhetorical carelessness. It is a precise signal calibrated for multiple audiences simultaneously. For the Iranian public standing in fuel lines in one of the world's most oil-rich nations, that phrase is confirmation of what they already suspected, that the pressure they are experiencing is not an accident of geopolitics but a designed outcome. For the Iranian military establishment, for the commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who have built an institutional identity around resistance to exactly this kind of American pressure, that phrase is not a threat, it is a provocation designed to force a reaction, designed to make the IRG demonstrate once again the very brittleness that its failures have already exposed. For the Pezeshkian government, for the pragmatists and technocrats who understood that Iran needed a way out, that phrase creates an impossible position. How do you negotiate with a nation whose president is publicly describing the outcome of those negotiations as regime change? How do you send your diplomats to Islamabad when the other side has just seized your ship in your own waters and simultaneously told your population that their government is being dismantled? The mixed message of threats and opportunity, as Al Jazeera's reporting correctly identifies, is not going down well with the Iranians, but describing it as a mixed message misunderstands its architecture. It is not mixed. It is layered. The threat and the opportunity are not contradictions. They are the two faces of the same instrument, designed to do different things to different audiences within the same Iranian political structure. The opportunity is extended to the Pezeshkian government, to the faction within Iran that understands economic reality, that understands what oil storage facilities approaching maximum capacity means for a nation whose entire revenue model depends on selling crude oil to international markets. The opportunity is real, and it is being held open deliberately because Washington understands that the pragmatists are the only Iranian faction with whom any durable agreement is possible. The threat is directed at the Revolutionary Guards, at the commanders whose institutional survival depends on the perpetuation of conflict, at the organization that has spent 40 years building an economic empire, a military apparatus, a parallel state within the state on the foundation of permanent, unending resistance. The threat is designed to force the IRG into a reaction that will either accelerate its confrontation with the Pezeshkian government or expose its inability to actually close the strait it has spent decades threatening to close. Washington is not making a single move. Washington is playing a game with multiple boards simultaneously, and the outcome on each board reinforces the outcomes on all the others. Let us now examine the geography of this moment with the precision it demands. Pakistan agreed to host these talks because Pakistan occupies a unique position in the regional architecture. It has relationships with both Washington and Tehran. It has historically served as a channel for communications that could not occur directly. Its decision to deploy 20,000 security personnel to lock down portions of its capital to create the infrastructure of serious diplomatic engagement was not a casual gesture. Pakistan invested real political and security resources in the preparation for these negotiations. Iran's decision to skip those talks, therefore, carries costs that extend beyond the bilateral relationship between Washington and Tehran. It signals to Islamabad that Tehran cannot be relied upon to follow through on diplomatic commitments. It signals to every regional actor watching this situation, and every regional actor is watching this situation, that Iran's diplomatic word has become contingent on factors that the Iranian government itself does not fully control. That is a catastrophic signal for a nation attempting to manage a crisis through diplomacy. The reason Iran cannot send its negotiators, the real reason beneath the official explanation, is the same reason that has been driving every Iranian decision for the past several months. The government does not control its own foreign policy when that foreign policy contradicts the institutional interests of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The moment the United States seized the Iranian cargo ship, the IRG had everything it needed to prevent the talks from happening. The argument writes itself in the framing that the Revolutionary Guards have perfected across decades of institutional dominance. You cannot negotiate with a nation that is simultaneously seizing your vessels in your own territorial waters. Sending diplomats to Islamabad in this moment would constitute an admission that Iran accepts American violation of its sovereignty. It would be the most visible possible demonstration that Iran kneels when American power is applied, and any Iranian government that sends its negotiators to talks, while its ships are being seized in the Strait of Hormuz, will not survive the political consequences inside Iran. The IRG did not need to issue an official order preventing the talks. The logic of their position, reinforced by the American action, was sufficient. The Pezeshkian government found itself once again in the position every Iranian president eventually discovers, trapped between the reality that engagement is the only path to economic survival and the political impossibility created by the IRG's institutional dominance of actually pursuing that engagement. And so the chairs remain empty in Islamabad, and JD Vance flies in anyway. This is worth dwelling on. The United States Vice President, traveling with a special envoy and the President's son-in-law, is flying to a city to conduct talks with an Iranian delegation that has announced it will not be there. This is not a diplomatic error. This is not a failure of coordination. It is a deliberate choice designed to make a specific point to specific audiences. By sending the delegation anyway, Washington is demonstrating that American strategic patience is, at this moment, functionally infinite. The Americans are prepared to sit at the table. The Americans have assembled the delegation. The Americans have communicated the framework. If Iran chooses not to come, the world can observe precisely who made that choice and who bears the responsibility for the consequences that follow from it. The frame is being constructed in real time for the historical record that will be written about this period. Washington is making sure that when that record is written, it reflects a United States that extended the opportunity, assembled the delegation, prepared the table, and an Iran that refused to engage because its own military prevented its government from doing so. That framing will matter enormously as the economic pressure continues to accumulate, as the consequences of Iran's inability to export oil deepen, as the damage to Iran's oil infrastructure becomes more permanent with each passing week. When Iran eventually does negotiate, and it will negotiate, the terms will be set by the party that was sitting at the table when the other party chose to stay home. Now let us speak about Lebanon, because the situation along Israel's northern border carries implications that connect directly to Iran's regional position and to the structural collapse of the proxy network that extended Iranian power across the Middle East. Al Jazeera's reporting confirms that a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon is holding despite repeated Israeli attacks. The United States has announced that a second round of talks between Israel and Lebanon will be held in Washington on Thursday. The word that requires examination in that reporting is despite. The ceasefire is holding despite repeated Israeli attacks. This formulation reveals the architecture of the current arrangement. Israel is testing the ceasefire's boundaries, probing Lebanese responses, demonstrating military freedom of action, while the diplomatic framework that constrains Lebanese retaliation remains in place. For Hezbollah, this situation encapsulates the fundamental transformation in its strategic position. An organization that spent decades presenting itself as the armed shield of Lebanese sovereignty against Israeli aggression is currently maintaining a ceasefire while Israel conducts operations that would previously have triggered a response. That restraint, whether it reflects strategic calculation or diminished capacity, signals something to every audience watching. The domestic Lebanese audience is watching an organization that built its political legitimacy on resistance except conditions that earlier versions of the same organization would have described as humiliation. The Iranian audience is watching the crown jewel of Iranian regional influence navigate a ceasefire framework that Washington is managing, with a second round of talks scheduled in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Beirut, not in any venue where Iranian influence is present. The Gulf states are watching the most capable non-state military actor in the region accept a negotiated framework that reduces its operational freedom while its Iranian patron faces a crisis that prevents it from providing meaningful support. The proxy network that Iran constructed across the Middle East was never held together by ideology alone. It was held together by money, by weapons, by the credible perception that Tehran could protect its partners when protection was needed. The IRG's failures have damaged that perception. Iran's economic crisis has reduced the money and weapons flowing through the network, and the organization that was the most visible demonstration of Iranian regional reach is now participating in Washington-managed diplomatic processes rather than conducting independent military operations. This is not a collapse of Iranian regional influence in the dramatic sense. It is something more insidious and more permanent. It is a quiet withdrawal, a slow evaporation, as each component of the network recalculates its position based on what its patron can actually deliver rather than what its patron once promised. The strategic reality that Washington has engineered is now visible in its complete form. Consider the architecture. Iran cannot sell its soil. Its storage facilities are approaching capacity. When they reach maximum capacity, wells will need to be shut. Shut wells sustain geological damage. That damage is permanent. The blockade is not merely cutting off current revenue. It is destroying future productive capacity every week that passes without a resolution makes the long-term damage deeper and less reversible. Iran cannot import refined petroleum products because it has no foreign currency to purchase them with. Gasoline lines are stretching across Iranian cities. A nation sitting atop vast oil reserves is experiencing fuel shortages. The social contract between the government and its population, the arrangement under which the people traded political passivity for economic stability, is dissolving. The IRG, whose institutional survival depends on resistance, is preventing the government from pursuing the negotiations that might arrest the economic collapse. The Revolutionary Guards are protecting their own existence at the cost of the state they were designed to defend. The Pezeshkian government, which understands the mathematics of the situation with complete clarity, possesses no mechanism to override the IRG's obstruction. The president can give orders. Those orders will not be followed if they threaten the fundamental interests of the organization over which he has no actual control. The proxy network is recalculating. Hezbollah is navigating Washington-managed ceasefires. The Houthis are negotiating harder as Iranian support becomes unreliable. Iraqi militias are finding that Tehran's phone calls go unanswered. The axis of resistance is becoming an axis of independent actors managing their own situations without a functioning patron. And now Iran will not be in Islamabad when JD Vance arrives. The trap was not built with missiles. It was built with mathematics, with geography, with the precise understanding of which pressures, applied in which sequence, would force a system to turn against itself. The United States did not need to defeat Iran externally. Washington created the conditions in which Iran's internal contradictions would do the work that external force cannot accomplish without catastrophic cost. Every scenario available to Iran's leadership leads through the same fire. If the IRG escalates externally, it worsens Iran's international isolation and deepens the economic pressure it is supposedly trying to resist. If the IRG moves directly against the Pezeshkian government, it fractures the regime in ways that cannot be repaired through internal negotiation. If the government manages to circumvent the IRG and send negotiators to talks, it faces the internal political consequences of appearing to negotiate under coercion, with its ships being seized in its own waters. And if nothing changes, the oil wells continue accumulating storage pressure until they must be shut, the fuel lines grow longer, the protests spread to more cities, the Artesh, Iran's conventional military, continues its quiet communications with the presidential faction, its accumulated resentments finding new focus in the gap between what the IRG receives and what ordinary soldiers experience. The regional proxies continue their individual recalculations. The regime's coherence continues its slow dissolution. Trump's public declaration that he has achieved regime change, combined with the offer of an opportunity, is designed to accelerate this process, not through external intervention, but by deepening the internal contradictions that are already tearing the system apart. By publicly claiming success, Washington forces the IRG into a posture of proving that the claim is wrong, which means escalating, which means worsening the situation, which means validating Washington's claim in the only way that matters, through outcomes. The people standing in gasoline lines in Iranian cities are not analyzing geopolitical strategy. They are experiencing the daily reality of a government that cannot provide what governments are supposed to provide. They are drawing conclusions that no propaganda can override, because propaganda cannot fill a fuel tank. The soldiers in Iran's conventional military are not conducting institutional analysis. They are remembering what it felt like when their wounded comrades waited for ambulances that never came because the Revolutionary Guards decided that Artesh soldiers were not worth the expenditure of their resources. They are having conversations with their officers about what they actually owe to an organization that treated their bleeding brothers as inconveniences. The foreign minister is sitting at a negotiating table with no chairs on the other side because the organization that is supposed to defend the nation he serves is removing those chairs before any foreign delegation can sit down. And in Islamabad, 20,000 security personnel are deployed. Parts of the city are locked down. The infrastructure of diplomacy is assembled and waiting. JD Vance is in the air, traveling to a table that one side has already announced it will not attend. History contains a template for what this structural configuration looks like as it approaches resolution. Regimes that appear powerful from the outside while rotting from within have a pattern that repeats with terrible consistency. The generals fight the diplomats, the people fill the streets, the security forces find themselves deployed into many cities simultaneously to respond effectively anywhere. The army begins having conversations it was never supposed to have. The proxies stop returning calls. The money runs out before the will to resist does. The IRG commanders who are preventing these negotiations believe they are saving the revolution. They believe that resistance, permanent, unending, non-negotiable resistance, is the only principle that justifies their existence, their budget, their autonomy, their empire, and they are not wrong about the logic of their position: negotiation with the United States on terms that Washington is now openly describing as regime change does threaten everything they have built. But the Iran they are fighting to preserve is already slipping away. The economy that funded their empire is being permanently damaged, week by week. The proxy network that extended their reach across the region is conducting its own quiet withdrawal. The population that once tolerated their dominance in exchange for stability is standing in fuel lines and drawing conclusions. The army that was supposed to fight alongside them is remembering ambulances that never came. JD Vance will land in Islamabad on Tuesday. The chairs will be empty. The world will watch a delegation assembled at the highest level of American executive power sit down at a table that Iran's government wanted to attend and Iran's military prevented from attending. And the clock on the oil storage facilities will continue counting down. and the fuel lines will continue growing, and the conversations inside Iran's conventional military will continue, and the proxies will continue their recalculations, and the ceasefire in Lebanon will continue holding, despite the Israeli attacks managed by Washington. Rather than by Tehran, the regime is kneeling toward the negotiating table in slow motion, one empty chair at a time, while its own generals stand behind it with their hands on its shoulders, keeping it from sitting down. For 46 years, the Islamic Republic survived by maintaining the myth of its own invincibility, by making the cost of confronting it appear higher than the cost of accommodating it, by positioning the Strait of Hormuz as a loaded weapon that could end the global economy if anyone pushed too hard. That mythology required the IRG's credibility to function. The credibility required the Strait to remain a genuine threat. The threat required the world to believe that Iran would actually follow through, that the Revolutionary Guards possessed both the capability and the will to close the world's most critical oil choke point. The American seizure of the Iranian cargo ship in the Strait this week is not a provocation. It is a proof of concept. It is a demonstration conducted in the most visible possible location that the geometry has changed, that what Iran threatened to close is operating under different terms, that the weapon Iran believed it held is pointing in a different direction than Iran understood. The Iranian government understood this. The Pezeshkian administration's willingness to send negotiators to Pakistan was the product of understanding this. The quiet diplomatic signals, the back-channel communications, the careful calibration of language suggesting Iran was prepared to engage, all of this was the work of a government that had done the mathematics and arrived at the only conclusion the mathematics support. The IRG also understood this, and that understanding is precisely why it cannot permit the negotiations to proceed, because the IRG's survival depends on the world believing that Iran will never negotiate away its fundamental posture of resistance. The moment Iran negotiates, the moment the Islamic Republic accepts terms with Washington, the ideological foundation of the Revolutionary Guard's existence is removed. Without permanent conflict, there is no justification for a parallel economy, a parallel military, a parallel state built on the principle that the revolution must be defended at all costs against all enemies forever. The IRG will sacrifice Iran's economy before it will sacrifice its own existence. The IRG will sacrifice Iran's diplomatic opportunities before it will sacrifice the resistance narrative that justifies every dollar of its budget. The IRG will sacrifice the Iranian population's access to fuel before it will sit across a table from Washington and accept that the era of permanent confrontation has produced results that the mathematics no longer support. This is not villainy in the simple sense. It is institutional self-preservation operating with the logic that all institutions apply when they face existential threat. But the consequences of that self-preservation applied to a nation of 85 million people whose wells are approaching shutdown capacity and whose children are standing in fuel lines are what they are. JD Vance lands in Islamabad on Tuesday. The chairs will be empty. The world will remember who was there and who chose not to come. And somewhere in Tehran, an oil storage facility is approaching its maximum capacity, and a fuel line is growing longer, and a soldier is having a conversation that no IRG commander can prevent from being had, and a proxy commander is looking at a funding transfer that has not arrived and asking the question that cannot be unasked. Once it has been articulated, if the patron cannot protect itself, can it protect us? The answer to that question, spreading quietly through the regional architecture that Iran spent decades constructing, is the sound of the Islamic Republic's strategic position dissolving, not with a dramatic collapse, not with a sudden rupture, but with the slow, irreversible, mathematically inevitable unwinding of a system that has run out of the resources required to sustain itself. Washington built this trap not with missiles, but with mathematics. And Iran, in the Strait of Hormuz, in the empty chairs of Islamabad, in the fuel lines of its cities, and in the quiet conversations of its conventional military, is discovering that the mathematics were correct. The opportunity remains open, for now the clock does not wait.